the game that I probably got more questions about today, believe it or not, than any other game. Alabama 20, LSU 14. This is not a first half total. This is the final score of the game. Alabama hangs a 20 spot on LSU at home, no less. LSU had several shots to take the lead and perhaps win the game, because I don't know how equipped Bama was to answer a score if LSU did score in the fourth quarter. They did not get it done. LSU forced a turnover with about 3 minutes and change left in the game in plus territory, and they couldn't score. They had several chances. If you missed this game, LSU had several chances. This was not Bama shutting them down, then they score a little backdoor touchdown to get it to within a slimmer margin than the game actually was played at. No, this was competitive, and LSU nearly found a way to win this game. Alabama had to do something they used to have to do all the time, but they don't have to do it much anymore. They had to ask the defense to win a game. And Will Anderson, which seems like about 3 people, even though he's just one when you watch him on TV, Will Anderson, Drew Sanders, good for him yesterday. I think Phil Mathis was wonderful for him yesterday. Those guys, Braswell, Shine, those guys got the job done for Alabama. But it was close. So let's dive into this, because all I could think when I was watching this game at its conclusion yesterday, all I could think was week 1 results are the devil. They're the literal devil. You might as well have Miss Boucher in your ear telling you, do not trust week 1 results. Do you remember in the summer when you and I would talk just freely and casually, as friends do in the summer, about Alabama? And I'd do some of the Q&As, and some Bama fans, you guys would ask, what should the expectation be this year? I mean, even you guys, in and around the Bama program, you knew you were losing a whole lot of talent, but you got talent on campus still, and all those recruiting classes, you don't just write them off. But the question was, how good can Bama really be this year when you lose so much first-round talent off one side of the ball? Let's remember those names: Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, Mac Jones, Najee Harris. So many guys that are just very, very hard to replace, and you lost them all at once. And so what we talked about as we were leading up to that Miami game, that's who Alabama opened with in week 1, is we were talking about how it's going to be a struggle early on. Eventually they'll find a rhythm and they'll be whatever maximum version of themselves they can be, but it wasn't going to be any kind of seamless transition. And what I kept saying was people need to get comfortable with the idea of Alabama struggling offensively. Maybe still winning games, but just having to do it a little bit different way than you're used to seeing. Then the Miami game happened, and they won 44-13, and I let it happen to me. I let it fool me a little bit. And all of a sudden, it made me seemingly look dumb, because I'd been sitting there telling you, hey, Miami, they've been given a lot of points in this game, and Alabama's going to have a lot more trouble than I think the perception would lead you to believe of replacing all this offensive talent. And then they blow Miami out. It was a lie. Week 1 lied to you. Since then, what have we seen? Well, we fast-forwarded a couple of months, and they've lost outright to Texas A&M, and they squeaked past Florida, and they squeaked past LSU. 6 yards total rushing yesterday. Even when I factor out the sack yardage, they barely rushed for 30 yards. Bama folks used to brag, deservedly so, about holding Leonard Fournette under 35 total yards rushing. LSU one-upped you last night in your own building. They did to you what you did to Fournette once upon a time. The only difference is this is not exactly a stone wall of an LSU defensive fortress that we're talking about this year. But how did this happen, and what does it mean? Because it's very strange. 2 hires that should have been grand slams for Alabama are drawing a lot of heat today. And I'm not so sure I don't agree with it, although I'm not one, as you well know by this point, to sit here and question individual play calling or individual technique that's being taught. Number one, because we don't really know. And secondly, I'm not the guy who's equipped to do that. I'm going to leave it to the experts on Twitter. But Doug Marrone goes from being an NFL head coach to being tasked with coaching Alabama's offensive line. And it seems like that is a legitimate move. It seems like that's a baller move by Nick Saban. He's just racking up former NFL head coaches to be position coaches. Well, their offensive line has looked poor. Outside of isolated spots, their offensive line has looked poor. And if you do listen to people who have coached the position for a living, they will talk in a lot more intricate detail about it not just being a talent issue, it's scheme specific. Again, I'm not wading into those waters because that's not a language I speak. But people who do speak the language, whomst I respect, do look at Doug Marrone and they say, man, I expected more. And then you work your way up the ladder a couple of rungs, and we're talking about Bill O'Brien. Bill O'Brien goes from NFL head coach to being a college offensive coordinator. And again, these are guys who are highly thought of. And it's just, again, if you talk to some people who coach the game themselves, I did a couple of times because, trust me, I had time sitting in a lonely airport terminal today. They just look at it and they say, look, I'm not throwing the guy on the trash heap wholesale. It's just what they're doing. Fundamentally, schematically, it didn't make a whole lot of sense. Given the pre-snap looks, for instance, and how much cushion at times on the outside you have by the way of LSU defensively playing you, there are just some things that would be automatic go-tos, staples, quick underneath stuff, slants and whatnot, that you just didn't see a whole lot yesterday that would have greatly alleviated some of the pressure. You look at the sacks and the pressures that LSU got on Bryce Young. It wasn't always defensive linemen. It was corners and it was linebackers. That's just blitzes getting home and inability to pick it up. And LSU having no qualms about doing it because you have no answer for it. Whew. So yeah, you expect that kind of stuff early in the game. Then you expect Alabama to settle in it. It was a game where they never really settled into it. So we said all last week that we were looking forward to this LSU game. Why? Not because we thought it was going to come down to the wire, even though it did. But I had circled this Alabama game coming out of the bye because I said to you last week, for better or for worse, I think we'll have a good indication of what Alabama's going to be through the stretch run. Well, I have no clue if last night is what Alabama's going to be through the stretch run, but if it is, they're not going to Atlanta. If it is, you may see other representation from the West. It may be Texas A&M. Do you guys realize, by the way, how close A&M was to grabbing control of the SEC West last night? Because you did not fathom that it was possible for LSU to beat Alabama, you had not allowed your mind to go there. And a lot of folks started having to Google SEC tiebreakers and whatnot last night and realized, wait a second, A&M, they just beat Auburn. So they got 2 conference losses, but they got the head-to-head over Alabama. If Bama loses here, that's their second conference loss, and head-to-head's the tiebreaker. Oh, my goodness. And we were that close. And they're still not out of the woods. Alabama could easily go and lose to Auburn, and if A&M runs the table, guess what you got? You got Aggies, Bulldogs in the SEC championship game if Texas A&M is able to take care of business. So that's a big if. A&M's playing Ole Miss this week, another single-digit point spread. But it was good to really see, I think, things finally come into focus. Now, it's not good if you're a Bama fan necessarily, but it makes a lot more sense because now we have proper context and we got a really proper backdrop because we have a plenty big enough sample size with Bama that we know who they are. They're a really good team. They're not a great team. They're certainly not an elite team. This is a really good team, which by Bama standards means it's one of the lower caliber teams that Nick Saban has had in a while. But that's all relative because we know even the lower caliber teams that Alabama under Saban has had are still capable, if things go right, of winning a championship. Here's the difference. The difference is this team, because they're just, quote unquote, really good, they are susceptible to real world problems. You're used to watching Bama and knowing that you could count on them doing what Georgia did yesterday, where even if they struggle for a quarter, eventually they're going to beat you by 4 or 5 touchdowns. Even the close games, even the games they struggle in, there's just this minimum baseline of talent you have to have, and if you don't have it, they will drown you eventually. Bama doesn't have that this year. At least they don't have that talent performing at that high a level. And as a result, they're just like the other really good teams out there. Now, they may be a step above a Michigan State, for example, but you watch Michigan State beat Michigan, then they lose by double digits to Purdue. How does that happen? Well, when you are not elite or you're not great, then you fall into that variance tub, and you never know what you're going to draw out. And that's the reality of Alabama football right now. They're in that group of teams that is simply really good. Really good means you're going to be favored. Really good means you should win those games. Up until the SEC championship game, Bama will be favored in every one of them. But it also makes seemingly inexplicable results. Like last night, it brings them into play. Whereas in any other year, you never would have that in play. Last year's Bama team, even if they don't show up, they end up pulling away in that kind of game. They they got away with legal felonies against LSU last year. Yes, there was a lot of filtration going on with what I wanted to say based on what I actually said. This year's team's just different. So the talent and the experience are the separators. That's what's pushing Bama this year. Florida even. The talent and more experience on some levels of that roster, it pushed Bama. A&M, definite talent, definite experience. You saw LSU last night. There's that minimum baseline of talent, and there were some experienced guys along that defensive line that gave Alabama problems. Here's the bigger issue. Georgia fits both of those parameters as good, if not better, than any team I just listed. They got a ton of talent, and they got a ton of grown men, physically and on their birth certificate. They got a ton of grown men. So that's where Bama is right now, but I'm telling you, we're going to talk about these other teams in just a second. Ohio State, Bama, Oklahoma, I don't believe any of them have played to their potential yet, and I don't think we're going to make it to December with none of them catching some kind of stride. I don't know who it's going to be. I don't know if it's going to be a 1 for 3, 2 for 3, or 3 for 3. I think it's coming from someone. You just run out of time. The calendar says November now, so you start running out of time.